Finally turning our attention to Sims 3 itself, however, when looking at the intro sequence this time, something which is now a staple at this point, much of the improvements I mentioned in the jump from the first game to the second pretty much apply here as well. The Sims we see appear to be retaining that same kind of style from 2, while having their features now have an additional sense of realism, changing the style a bit, with models here looking a bit less cartoony, but in a way, that still works, appearing more like what they would have wanted Sims to look like back then, compared to any grandiose switch up. We get a few scenes showing off certain activities that will be mainly performed inside our house. Things like cooking, playing games, spending time with our family, nothing we haven't seen before. What you'll notice after that point though is exactly what I talked about towards the end of Sims 2. We're taken away from the residential environments and are shown several scenes of Sims doing things outside. Going to the gym, driving around, riding bikes, going to the park. As you already started seeing in the previous game, and as you're seeing right now, this shift is one of the most sizable by far. There's such an emphasis being put on going out and about now, and especially in this case, there's a very good reason for that, and that can ultimately be boiled down to those selection of shots on cars and bikes. Featuring these in the intro isn't merely padding or trying to make the game seem more expansive than it actually is. Compared to before, where cars were basically just our own personal way of transitioning to each area, now, because of how each neighborhood's laid out, we get to actually experience our car and experience the travel, which is a massive and brilliant change, as we'll eventually see. Using our car before was always quite underwhelming. When you chose to go out and take it for a spin, for example, you merely saw your sim getting in, disappearing, and then you had to wait till they came back. Well now, if you want to go out for a drive, you can actually go out for a drive, witnessing their journey every step of the way. As I say, that's why the focus on things outside of home life is particularly essential in the intro's case. There's been a genuinely brilliant evolution to the neighborhood system in this game, and one that, as we're about to see, makes doing those things around our neighborhood even more appealing than before. Starting the game's the exact same as always. You first choose where you want to play from a list of neighborhoods, this time being a list that can genuinely be pretty huge depending on what DLC you've got and which additional ones you've purchased from the new Sims store we now have. You've got everything from your standard suburbia to those desert environments to brand new places we haven't seen at all up till now. Take the likes of Lunar Lakes, a neighborhood set on a completely different planet in outer space. Or how about Monte Vista, a neighborhood that features clear inspiration from Italian environments and architecture. Not that it has to be said really, but the amount of options we can pick now is pretty amazing. We went from 6 main neighborhoods in Sims 2, with the very long-winded option of creating our own neighborhood with some of the empty presets, to now 14 that, for the most part, are all entirely unique from each other. But even then, you do want some neighborhoods here that are essentially alternate versions of certain environments, as that in itself allows the player even more options. You could choose to play in the city of Bridgeport, for example, or you might want to choose the city of Roaring Heights. Either way, it's not like you're getting one of every type. In some you do, there's no more alien planets like Lunar Lakes, but the options here are ones that I have to imagine still remain very appealing even to those who played this game to death. The previous games are already replayable enough, and Sims 1 managed to be replayable while basically relying on one neighborhood with a few external districts. Sims 3's in a different universe compared to that now. If I assume correctly, I'd imagine most players will end up finding their personal favourite neighborhood over time and mainly settling with that one when coming back in the future. However, the sheer fact that all these other options are now here, with so many different neighborhoods, new buildings, new places to explore, from my view, there is such a slim chance a game like this could ever stop giving. From experience, you already have to put a good amount of hours into a single neighborhood to actually feel like you've properly experienced it, before you actually start noticing the cycles you're going through and want something fresh. Apply that mentality to every neighborhood we get in this game, and you've got a ridiculous amount of content to experience. Don't get me wrong though, I don't regard content as a metric of quality in any shape or form. There's plenty of games I've seen that could be described as having loads of content, but if the content isn't quality, then it basically amounts to nothing. Why would I want to experience hours of content that isn't particularly satisfying? As we'll see for ourselves, however, I'd say that doesn't apply to much of what we see in Sims 3, to be honest. As to not go over ground we've already talked about, there's not much to actually say in regards to the process of getting into each neighbourhood. We're still given those nice intros of each place. We can then shape the neighbourhood in whatever way we see fit, removing lots, building houses, adding decorations, and then finally, when we find a place we like, whether it be an empty or preset lot, we can move in a set household or create our own character. One thing you will notice about this neighbourhood screen, however, is how we have a difference when it comes to how close we can observe this place. In Sims 1, you were locked in place. You can move anywhere, everywhere, and you couldn't zoom in. Sims 2 allowed you to move around and zoom, but the zoom itself still held you back quite a bit. Sims 3 now lets you get right up close to everything, allowing you to really witness what certain areas are like from the ground level, and giving you even more ways to observe things like your decorations directly from the neighborhood screen. This does end up revealing some of the reduced textures when it comes to some of the houses, but that doesn't really matter, and I assume the reason this was done once again ties back to the open world nature of this game we're about to dive into. In the past two games, the neighborhood screen was the only way to see your entire neighborhood all at once, whereas in Sims 3, there's no restrictions at all. We can observe our neighborhood as a whole at any time, whether we're on this screen or actually playing. Therefore, there's quite literally no reason to hold back in any regard like we saw previously. Jumping into the character customization, while having the same setup as last time, being able to rotate and zoom into your sim, as well as having a mirror behind so you can see all angles at all times, there's some pretty significant options that have now been added, which, as you could assume, expand the amount of variables that can be tweaked to our character. We'll go through each tab one at a time like the previous entries, and when it comes to name, age, and gender, there's some pretty big changes to see. The wildest coming from options like the supernatural types, which were added as part of the supernatural DLC. This means that right from the off, compared to simply creating a human, we can now have our sim take on the role of a werewolf, a fairy, and even a ghost. Now these roles were also able to be taken on in Sims 2, with that game also featuring supernatural types like vampires and witches. But in that game, becoming those things was completely separate to creating your sim. As I say, now it's a case of being those things right from the start, whereas before you were always a human that could transform into something else. As these are something which have been present for a while now though, I'd say it's only right we looked at some of these before getting into some of the other customization options. Now funny enough, a large amount of these were actually present going all the way back to the first game. Ghosts were likely one of the most common supernatural types you would have seen to begin with. The key word there being seen, as unlike later games, you weren't really able to play as any of the supernatural types in this game. In making magic, you could obviously become a user of magic, casting spells, making potions, and so on. But that's about the closest things get. There's no set magician role you can eventually give yourself. You just use magic while remaining human. Things like ghosts and genies are entirely separate in the first game. You yourself can't become them and control them. They're merely NPCs that you can observe and interact with. Ghosts in Sims 1 were pretty hilarious. You'd find they show up in scenarios like when one of your sims dies, popping up randomly to haunt your sim, where we can also witness their new green ethereal appearance, as well as the way in which they now phase through walls and objects. So while the supernatural types we get in future games may be more expanded, it shouldn't be mistaken the earlier games were any different particularly. Despite the foundations of this series being quite grounded, we've seen for a while that much of what we see actually isn't based in reality. Things like ghosts, genies, and the Grim Reaper, for example, have always been a thing, despite being concepts based in fantasy. The closest we get in the first game to an actual playable supernatural figure is a zombie. This can have a chance of happening in the event the Grim Reaper shows up, and you've got another sim in the household that can beg for their lives. The Reaper will then likely give you a game of rock, paper, scissors, a brilliantly charming detail, where in the event you lose, the other sim gets brought back as a zombie. The actual effects of this are pretty nothing though. Despite now having a different, more ghoulish appearance, there's not any gameplay differences that create any real impact. Sims 2 and 3 is where things got a whole lot more elaborate. Unlike before, where they were mainly NPCs, now we could actually play as things like aliens, vampires, werewolves, and plant sims. When visiting the Three Lakes destination in the Bon Voyage DLC, we can even find Bigfoot and invite him into our home, making a literal Sasquatch a playable character. Outside of being playable now, the biggest switch up in this game's case is the number of unique traits each of these types now have. Using the zombie as a comparison, there's several things we see compared to last time which now reinforce the zombified nature of these sims, as opposed to back then when you could basically just say they turn green. Appearance-wise, you could assume their looks get changed to fit in with their new zombified state, but you'll also notice they now have unique animations too, with zombies shambling instead of walking. And on top of that, zombies will now always produce a foul smell, as you might expect from the living dead. Not ginormous differences, but still a more fleshed out version of this zombie concept. Where things get properly different, however, is when it comes to ones like the vampires and werewolves that we see. Vampires, for example, not only have the appearance changes you can imagine, the grey skin, skin, the fangs, but they also have unique traits and abilities that will genuinely switch up what your motivations might be and how you might play. For example, when influencing a vampire, you can actually command them to bite another Sim's neck, meaning that you can transform other Sims into vampires too. In terms of how they can switch up your routines, vampires are obviously well known to start burning when light shines on them, which also applies here. Your Sim's needs will now start rapidly decreasing if you find yourself in broad daylight, with that alone already changing up your playstyle quite a lot. So those are just a few examples when it comes to how vampires in Sims 2 can change how you play pretty drastically. And that's great, to be honest. If you are going in this more fantasy-based route, go the whole hog and actually flesh them out. To have these merely be an appearance change would be quite underwhelming, and in expanding the types of Sims we can now witness, it not only keeps the ones we're controlling more varied and interesting, but it also makes the ones we simply interact with more interesting as well. And when it comes to Sims 3, you get exactly what you'd expect from having this system return, yet another expansion in about every department you can imagine. We'll look away from vampires, despite them also having a pretty huge evolution, and look to something like a werewolf. Werewolves in Sims 2, much like all the supernatural types, was something you actively had to become, as opposed to creating your Sim as a werewolf right from the start. This was done by having a random interaction with a wolf referred to as the leader of the pack, where upon befriending it will give your Sim a small bite, thus turning him into a werewolf. I find the core mechanics of the werewolf to actually be somewhat better in Sims 2 due to their more defined nature. For example, as you might expect, werewolf Sims will transform when it turns nighttime and switch back when it becomes morning. Between this time, you'll see needs like their energy will rise and their hunger will plummet, reinforcing the rabid beast-like need to feast. Sims 3, however, tones down these parts in favour of giving the player more freedom. Werewolf transformations can now be activated any time by you, meaning that it could be the middle of the day, you transform into a werewolf, do whatever you need to do, and transform back. It takes away from the whole curse-like nature of these beings. I obviously get that if you found yourself turning into one of these things, the idea of taking on these new powers is ultimately what you're aiming for. But I do feel maybe a slight bit of restraint would have benefited the system here to really reinforce the whole idea of a werewolf in general. I do understand there are certain things that can feed into what I'm saying, the key one being the feral change moodlet that can get applied to us, which stops us from transforming back until it goes away. But as I say, in regards to most of these supernatural types, the degree to which we have control might just be a bit too much. Crazy, I know, considering how much of an advocate for control I usually am for any game I play. But understand that when looking at all the games here, I think the choice to have these Sims showcase free will is vital towards how I've always perceived them. It keeps me in the role as the observer, not one who's actually inhabiting these Sims' lives. And I feel that role's important to define in this case, as it's something I look at as being a very unique quality of these games compared to other ones I play, retaining that focus on individual human lives, while as I say, having us be this godlike influence on them, like trapping ants under a glass and watching how they act. While the functions may be similar to other games you've played, the intentions are different. You might say turn-based games like XCOM also have us in a godlike role, influencing these soldiers' actions in combat, but as I say, that's why free will's so important. It brings in the unique charm and even bizarreness we can feel in moments, because these guys are doing things outside of what we tell them to. In XCOM, if you don't make a move, your soldiers won't do anything. Point is anyway, in giving so much control to the player, as we mainly see when it comes to the werewolf transformations, you can actually diminish the purpose of certain aspects, not ones that are solely related to supernatural abilities, but more standard ones too. So I hope that look of certain supernatural types gives you a general idea of what you can run into in Sims 3 now. No matter what kind of environment you're in, it's no longer unusual to have these outlandish kinds of characters present themselves to you. You could be going to a class at university and just see a fairy flowing about. You could be hanging out at home and all of a sudden there's zombies outside. It's a full-on embrace towards the style of that Making Magic DLC all the way back in the first game. In many ways, I feel you could almost describe that as the catalyst towards the general tone of these games from there on in. Ones where anything starts to seem possible, as opposed to before where it was pretty grounded in real-life mundanity, even despite the goofy nature of many elements. Coming back to the customization, however, age-wise, you've got the exact same options as last time, ranging from toddler to elder. However, beneath that, you'll notice a few options that, despite not being brand new, have now been made far more dynamic. Female Sims have one genuinely new feature, that being the adjustment of their breast size. But outside that, the options are the same between both male and females. You might notice though, that compared to before where all the skin tone and body modifier options were far more static, giving you literally two types of body and a range of only 4 light and dark skin tones, these have now all been converted to sliders. Customization in Sims 3 has been taken to a whole nother level in my opinion, and this is the first real sign of that. Just think back to the hair colours in Sims 2 for example. You only had 4 to choose from, from, with the same obviously going for the skin tones, as I also mentioned. Look at the way in which we customize something like our skin now. You've got the slider that we can now move to make our skin lighter or darker, giving us significantly wider and more fine-tailored customization now with the incredibly minute adjustments we can make. But on top of that, by accessing the base colors beside this slider, you'll notice there's now a broad range of colors we can apply to our sim. If we want our sim to appear purple, they can now genuinely be purple. And with the slider, it's not just allowing us to make them purple, it lets us turn them into the exact tone of purple we want as well. These are things I perceive as really important in regards to our customization of these sims, as it indicates how the floodgates are now basically wide open. It's gone from presets in the first game, which I think were more out of necessity, then to broader customization options in Sims 2, while retaining the more realistic side of things for the most part, to now this in Sims 3, where you really can turn your sim into something truly bizarre right from the off. If you want to create a malnourished, green-coloured werewolf, that option's right there for you to explore. Regardless of how many players find these options genuinely appealing, I think it's very important they're here, with the reason for that coming back to something I've reinstated time and time again. The more options you give and the more minute they are, the less overlap you're going to have. Why does overlap matter in this case? Because these are games that for the most part are all about your own individual experiences when interacting with this virtual sandbox. All the options are the same for each player, it's merely about how they choose to interact with and utilize them. That's why I perceive sliders as so important when it comes to customizing our character. By stepping away from set options and implementing this far broader and more dynamic spectrum, the outcomes of what a sim will appear like basically become endless. Not to mention as well, when looking at sections like the body modifiers in Sims 3, the ranges we can witness now are even more substantial compared to what we saw before. You set the body weight of your sim to the bottom, they look genuinely skinny. You raise it up, they look properly massive. So you can naturally assume that in between these two ends of the spectrum, because of how this slider gradually expands parts of your character like their gut, their neck size and their arms, you can now essentially find the perfect size for your sims. And you pair up the sliders beneath that one, where your sim's muscles can be expanded and their definition being more overt. As I say, you've got a near endless amount of variations already. It doesn't matter if they look similar, as you can naturally assume many sims bodies will. It's about the fine tweaks that create an impact for the player personally, because now that is very much the case. We're now dealing with a truly extensive customization system, and one where each time you come back to it, you're incredibly unlikely to create something similar to what you created before, unless you're purposely trying to. Facially, things admittedly aren't too different across the board. Aside from a few new options here and there, the basic principle's still the same. You've got the initial preset to choose from, and then a bunch of sliders to usually enlarge or shrink individual features. Outside that, the only things I'd highlight as being notable additions are the different eye colours, where much like we can do with the clothing now, we're able to work with a full-on colour wheel to get the exact colour we want. And I also like the additions of the topical marks and tattoos. Again, for someone like me, who definitely wasn't the most well versed in these games before making this video, it's interesting to find out that pretty common features like freckles or moles were simply not present in Sims 2, so I'm glad to see them here. They're not customizable like everything else, simply being an option you can turn on and off, but still good to see. Tattoos on the other hand definitely are customizable, but in a way, I found they're a feature in most games to be honest that for tattoo lovers won't be all that satisfying. Reason being, a tattoo's something that people tend to apply on themselves for a few select reasons. They might want to imprint something on them that has meaning, say a family member's name or a certain date that's important to them. They may simply witness certain designs and want to put that on themselves too. Either way, I perceive tattoos to be debatably one of the most important fashion choices you can get. The idea that something's going to be permanently stained on your skin means that for the vast majority, I assume a considerable amount more thought's going to be put behind what's going on your skin compared to a shirt or jacket that you can take off if you don't like how it looks. And with that comes a uniqueness with many designs. As I say, having many feature certain details that are not only important, but maybe also ones that can only be understood by those getting that tattoo. That's mainly why I find tattoo options in games to be considerably underwhelming, and that's coming from someone who's got no tats at all. Because of what they are and why people tend to get them, having a selection of presets to choose from, and ones that in this game aren't all that great to be honest, it goes directly against the idea of what tattoos are all about. Individual expression. Now you could say that same individual expression's not shown off in the clothing, and all of those presets too. We don't personally design all our clothes before having them made for us, but that's simply accepted. As I say, there's more weight with a tattoo due to the permanency of it, and let's just say that if put in a real life context, and the only options I had for a tattoo were things like a gnome, a record player and some cards, I don't think the thought would even cross my mind to get one. I'm glad it's here still, and I like the way in which each one can be further customized with the advanced option at the bottom, but there's definite room for improvement. Where there has been huge improvement however is when it comes to our hair. Taking the options we've got out of the equation, which despite being expensive expanded again to an excellent degree will always be based in personal taste. The biggest evolution we see this time comes from the colours we can now apply to our hair. You can see the presets at the bottom have now been expanded from 4 to 8, with these once again focusing purely on natural hair colours, where this time you've got more variations on ones like blonde, red and black, as well as being able to apply grey hair on Sims of any age now. When pressing the paintbrush in the bottom right, however, you'll see these presets merely scratch the surface for the hair customization this time. Those 8 colours we saw before are now expanded even further, being laid out in a tab referred to as swatches, which basically just means presets obviously. Great in itself, but beside that, you can see we now also have access to the colour wheel as well, making Sims 3 the first game where you can finally get wacky with your hair and change the colour of it to literally anything you want. Bright pink, dark green, cyan, all of these are now on offer. And much like I talked about in regards to the body sliders, a colour wheel like this is simply yet another way to make no two Sims ever appear the same. Think about the amount of options we've now looked at, how many variables are being taken into account. As I say, unless you're purposely following step for step how to create a particular Sim, I just don't see how it's ever possible now for someone to coincidentally create something similar to someone else. The hair colours and the colour wheel take that idea even further, and on top of that, there's still more variation to see. Because if you look above the colour options, you'll notice that when changing colours in this menu, we're only affecting one of 4 sections. You've got the base, roots, highlights and tips, all of which can be turned any colour you want. And for all those hair lovers out there who perhaps want to perfectly recreate the colours they've got, or create the exact kind of blend they desire, you can very well do that. There's such depth to all these aspects now, the exact kind of expansion I was hoping to see coming off the already big expansion we saw in Sims 2. And then of course we find ourselves back at the clothing once more, featuring a ridiculous number of options at this point where you can truly spend hours searching, trying to find the perfect outfit for your Sim. But much like everything we've touched on so far, there's now additional customization options outside purely the clothes that just gives absurd levels of variation. I feel we've now reached a point where no matter who you are, how much you like these games, and how much you like aspects like customization specifically, you simply won't be able to look at all the options that are on offer in any kind of reasonable time frame. In the first game, you definitely could. The second game started pushing it because of how many different combinations were in the everyday section, but Sims 3 is just next level. We're talking several hours if you truly want to see how a vast number of these shirts, jeans, shoes, and accessories appear on your Sim. And again, it's all about the several different variables at play compared to previous entries, with some of these presenting a ridiculous number of outcomes for literally every single bit of clothing. The number of them to begin with, even when not customizing them further, is still ridiculous. There's just so many clothing items in this game. You've then got the fact the whole mix and match system now not only applies to everyday clothing, but every single outfit now, with the only restriction at this point being how there's still no crossover between male and female clothing, with the same going for things like hairstyles too. Outside that, you've just got an absolutely massive amount of options, so many that, as I say, I can definitely see plenty, perhaps even most players, simply settling with something they think looks good, as opposed to finding something that's actually perfect for their tastes. Chances are, with how many items that are on offer, it's purely the overwhelming amount of choice that could potentially end up restricting that in my view. The UI is not too different to what we saw last time, but there are some things I find to be a bit more annoying. The reason these issues crop up is because of the amount of choice. No matter what you do, you can't expand the amount of items you see. You're always locked to 9 items at a time, with you obviously having to scroll up or down to reveal more. However, because there's now also many outfits and clothing items that have so many different variations, different styles, colours and patterns for example, they now have to resort to a horizontal scrolling system for some of these. All this not only made the navigation of these menus more overwhelming, but also quite a bit more convoluted at points. There came a point where after scrolling page after page of items, I was simply wishing for some kind of expansion to these menu screens. Realistically, but I don't know why it needs to be this small to begin with. I like the space and scenery that surrounds our Sim, but it's not essential. I'd take a much wider menu that lets us see more items at once, even if it meant covering up areas like the nearby couch or window, because they just don't matter as much. But we have what we have, and what we've got is a pretty minuscule menu for one of the widest ranges of clothing items you can imagine. Not what you want really. What is great though is the create a style option at the bottom, essentially being the clothing equivalent of the advanced hair options we saw a second ago. What's especially excellent about this feature though is that due to all these styles being texture based, you're able to transform quite literally any clothing item into exactly what you want it to be. Think of it like this: because of create a style, all that matters now basically is the model you're choosing. The step up here is truly massive. Whereas before you were lucky to even get multiple variations of an outfit that merely changed the colour of it, now you can not only change the colour of each outfit outfit to whatever you want, with each one having multiple sections you can customize individually, just like your hair, but you can even change the type of material each part's made out of too. So there's multiple things there, and we can break them all down by looking at a few examples in the menu itself. It can all be seen in the panel that shows up on the right hand side, where as you can see, you've got 4 boxes that highlight what parts of the outfit can be changed. From there, you can use the material menu at the top to select from a wide range of materials, each one having a fairly good number of options too. That's where the clothing system really elevates for me. Just look at how much depth there is now to each part of our clothing, and how fine tailored we can make them to suit our exact tastes. We can stay with the default material and simply change its color. We can decide if we want to change the color of merely one part of the outfit or multiple parts. We could have those colors match up, contrast, or whatever. And with the materials, we can choose anything from leather, fabric, all the way to wood, plastic, and stone. As I've kept saying, realism really doesn't matter at this point. If you want to wear something that's got the texture of wood or metal, you can now do that. But it's not just that. You'll see when it comes to all these materials, it's not merely a case of making your clothing appear a certain way. Each section has their own individual patterns. So, if you go into fabric, there's plenty of different styles to witness. The reason I assume this gets brought in is in relation to a grander switch up, relating to how many textures can now be switched up, as we'll eventually see. Textures across the board are as malleable as ever. If you like the design of something, but don't like the actual patterns and colours of it, chances are you'll be able to repeat this exact same kind of process to make it perfectly suit your tastes. In relation to purely clothing, however, unbelievably, there's even more detail on top of that. Not only can we apply all these materials to each separate layer, but upon doing that, you'll oftentimes notice that even more customization ends up getting introduced in relation to the individual colours of each pattern. The one you see here, for example, that features these circular patterns, there's now 4 more colours we can change that relate to each type of circle, as well as the base colour behind them. So when breaking it all down, we've now got tons of clothing items to begin with, which can then be further customised to switch up several individual parts of that clothing, with that very customization now relaying to another massive list of textures that, once again, can be applied to every single layer that we're given, and on top of that, even those textures can be further customized. It's truly fantastic. The sheer level of depth in the clothing system now really is quite amazing. If you thought the jump from Sims 1 to Sims 2 was big, the jump from 2 to 3 is absolutely massive. You can wear what you want whenever you want, and whatever you wear can pretty much be whatever you want at this point too. Outside that, there's not much else to see here particularly. The final tab, as we know, relates to our Sim's personality, something else that's been reworked quite a bit in this game. Compared to the last two, which worked off the idea of star signs and personality points, now we're made to assign individual traits to each Sim that'll mold their personality even more tightly. Which is great, obviously. The closer you can make your Sim display certain traits right from the off, the more your overall vision comes to life. I feel traits are a far more interesting concept compared to the personality points. While they still work fine, the categories were all rather broad, yet also quite restrictive. There's more nuance ultimately in the trait system. So for example, whereas before you were either more neat or more sloppy, now we can apply the clumsy trait to our Sim to land somewhere in between that. Being clumsy doesn't inherently mean you're sloppy. Your Sim might be very neat, but still end up messing something up because of their clumsiness. Not to mention, there's also traits here that are just far more fine-tailored, ones that essentially couldn't be interpreted before with the previous categories. You've got traits like can't stand art, which, like it says, will mean any Sim with this trait will react negatively to any art they observe. You've also got ones like kleptomaniac, another unique trait that results in your Sim naturally stealing things on their own. Or how about hydrophobic, which makes them afraid of swimming. You can naturally see how these are far more unique compared to what we had before. These aren't traits that are solely relating to our needs. They fit more in line with something like the Fallout New Vegas trait system. We're learning straight away what our Sim likes and dislikes, how they act and carry themselves, because we are literally setting some of these values. It shouldn't be underestimated either. There's some genuinely great ones in here, like the insane trait, that can generate some really funny moments. With this one in particular, just taking your Sim off the rails slightly, in the best possible way. And it's a good trait to look at when it comes to what certain traits unlock in a Sim. Some parts of this trait are natural. They happen on their own. For example, one thing insane Sims will do is dress up in clothing that's unsuitable and may be inappropriate for certain occasions. Therefore, if you head to the funeral of someone who's drowned, they might decide to put on some speedos to grieve in the worst way possible. However, insane Sims also have unique interactions that only they can perform. For example, doing things like fishing in a swimming pool or starting conversations about conspiracies. These are things that can only be done by Sims with this trait. And as I say, you pair that up with 4 other individual traits, many of which have that same level of depth, and you're being given the chance to genuinely flesh out your Sims for the first time. You no longer have to merely envision what they think and act like. You can simply witness it play out on screen. A great great system, and one that I think's far superior to the personality points that came before it. Finally, alongside the traits, we now have to assign our sim a lifetime wish, having 86 to select from when factoring in all the ones that come with the expansion packs. These replace the aspiration system from Sims 2, but still ultimately serve the same purpose. They're a mark of what direction you want your sims to pursue. So if you want them to pursue a life where your sim becomes a brilliant cook, the celebrated 5-star chef wish fits right in line with that. To achieve a wish, certain conditions need to be met, with these obviously varying depending on which one you pick. Whereas the chef one we just mentioned requires you to reach level 10 in the culinary career, you can naturally assume a wish like chess legend requires you to pursue the logic skill, as well as becoming a chess grandmaster. Much like the lifetime aspiration from before though, just because you choose one of these, it doesn't mean you have to pursue it. I view it merely as another way to entice a certain kind of player. We've already talked about those who want to build over anything else, or those who want to live out a sim's life compared to anything else. The lifetime wishes, so while obviously being more in the category of the live mode for the most part, is another aspect of that. For players who may have looked at building and the live mode as rather pointless before, they now may have their minds changed due to how they're given a set motivation. It's wisely appealing to a different kind of audience that, even going all the way back to SimCity, were almost intentionally ignored. The philosophy with all the sim games, not just the Sims, was to pursue the simulation route at all costs, which obviously meant there could never really be any end goal. And while that still applies to all the Sims games, we do at least have some kind of end goal now that's more defined. Players who prefer to play games that have more linear routes to a set ending will most definitely be enticed by this. Their individual playthrough could be solely reliant on achieving this lifetime wish, and once they complete it, that could mark the end of their playthrough, in which they can now move on to the next one. And in given those kind of players, that definitely exist by the way, this new cycle to work with, they'll find themselves experiencing and appreciating parts of the game that otherwise may have seemed unappealing to them before. Outside that, we can now also choose things like our favourite food, music and colour, as well as finally being given a say in how our sim sounds, being able to choose from 3 set voices, with a pitch bender below to make their voice higher or lower pitched. All round, the customization here continues on from what Sims 2 set up in a brilliant way. You get more of everything you can imagine, get even more depth in those same areas that makes customization near endless. You simply aren't going to see every combination of clothing, material and colour because there's just too many. And there's no question that upon its release, Sims 3 not only had the best character customization in the series itself, but also one of the most impressive ones in gaming at large. The only thing you could argue other games have over a game like Sims 3 in this department is mechanical depth. We're talking about role-playing games like Dark Souls or Skyrim, games where despite not having anywhere near as many stylistic options, gives the player substantially different gameplay roles to pursue. We're obviously getting a taste of that in regards to aspects like the traits, but they're still not impactful enough to be compared anywhere near to the likes of a Dark Souls with the many different playstyles we can personally pursue. To put it bluntly though, Sims just ain't that kind of game. I think they ultimately do the right thing here, in fact the perfect thing, by going heavy in the direction of customization once again, while now flirting with ideas like traits and wishes. When you boil everything down, it's all about time and resource management. What are the dev team going to put more of their time into? And ultimately, but I think it's always a wiser choice with these games to diversify and expand the stylistic options compared to anything else. One final thing I want to briefly mention is in relation to the new types of Sims we can actually create, with this applying to ones that were brought in during Sims 2 as well. Since the first game, we've had access to pets, with dogs and cats being ones that we could actually purchase and own. You had things like birds and fish, but those were decorative really. When buying a cat, for example, it's treated as another family member, and one that you actively have to look after. Much like our Sims, you had a number of cats and dogs you could choose from when buying them, but no real customization outside that. Sims 2 expanded these pet options, now having things like birds and fish actually have to be looked after. The big change though came from the addition of dogs and cats to the Create a Sim screen, allowing us to make them part of the family right from the off. And on top of that, you can naturally assume we can now actually customize them to create the perfect companion, with the options here being surprisingly broad. Even when comparing them to the options we get for children or toddlers, the number of ways we can customize our pair ends up seeming quite impressive. You can choose what kind of breed it is, if it's young or old, if it's small or large in size, and most importantly, there's a great amount of depth when it comes to aspects like what its coat looks like, being able to add tons of unique little spots and marks around its body, adding that extra feel of realism. You can also make adjustments to the size of its coat. You can pretty much warp and morph your pet's facial features in the exact same way as your normal Sims, and you're even able to adjust its personality, being more simplified compared to our Sims, but making sense, considering we're dealing with dogs and cats here. And then when it comes to Sims 3, you obviously get more options to customize in the dogs and cats, but now we also have a brand new animal to create, that being a horse. This makes it 3 animals that we can now control ourselves, with the areas we can change on a horse being what you'd expect, being able to change its hair, its eye colour, and also being able to morph and reshape several parts of its body. Overall, with the importance pets serve in many families all over the world, it's no wonder they were added way back in the first game, and with each new release, you can naturally assume that not only did the customization get deeper, but their overall functionality did as well, where upon reaching Sims 3, we can now have dogs that search out valuables for us when being assigned certain traits, and even when it comes to our horse, we can actually enter horse racing competitions, where we have to train and bond with our horse to be the best. Good stuff. From the customization screen, you already know what the routine is by this point. Set up in a preset and experience the world of Sims 3 for a while. One thing I wasn't a big fan of straight away ties into the expansion packs I had. Due to me having all the DLC this game had to offer, we get a similar intro to what we saw in the first game with the Make and Magic DLC, one that I never liked. As opposed to letting us roam around for a while and get to grips with the game, we're immediately made to witness not 1, but 2 expansion pack related NPCs that arrive at our house. The first being the Sims University mascot, which as you could assume is part of the University Life DLC. But even more intrusive is the time portal that shows up shortly after, now having this giant machine show up at the front of your house, where upon interacting with it, a time traveller comes out who will eventually take us to the future. For someone like myself, who's not the most familiar with a game like Sims 3, it felt like there was too much going on in such a short span of time. As I say, you kind of want players to ease themselves into the experience, whereas here, if you own certain expansion packs, the moments following the purchase of your house can be quite chaotic. If these were spaced out over a couple days, I'd be a lot more happy, but I do also understand the counter to that, where if you bought the DLC while having already experienced Sims 3 many times, being made to wait a few days could be pretty annoying too. You can't really win, and I felt this way back in the first game too with the mystery man that shows up. When opening the box, you're given a whole bunch of magic items that can really clutter up your lot, while slowing down the actions you may have otherwise wanted to pursue. Good for those who want to experience those things straight away, but bad for the initial experience in my opinion. With that being said, I only feel it's right to start discussions of the worlds in this game by highlighting the most significant leap forward yet. That being the fact that when it comes to quite literally every location in the game, we're now in a fully open world. We're still dealing mainly with neighbourhoods obviously, so the open world I refer to isn't really based on expansion, despite some of these places being pretty damn big. It's more about how they've now eliminated essentially all loading screens upon launching into our neighbourhood, with the only exceptions being when we go to a different location altogether. The clearest way to lay out the difference this time is by comparing 2 identical trips in both Sims 2 and 3. We discussed before how the vehicles in that game were slightly underwhelming in my eyes, despite being a fun and necessary inclusion. The key disappointment for me came directly from how the world's treated in that game, as due to how each lot is heavily segmented from each other, we saw that when you take your car for a spin, you don't actually get to see that action play out. Using the example of going to a grocery store, our sim would get in their car, drive out the lot, where we then get brought to a loading screen before being taken straight to the store, in which we see our sim draw up and get out. The lack of seeing our sim actually drive there, as well as the loading screen, breaks the immersiveness of the sequence, with immersion obviously being one of the most important traits of these games overall. Witness how a trip to the grocery store now plays out in Sims 3. No matter if you've got a car or not, travel in general is just made far easier to begin with, whereas it was either selecting from a set menu before taking off, or calling up a taxi and waiting for him to arrive. The process was quite a bit more drawn out in Sims 2. In Sims 3, no matter if you're clicking on your car to go to a community lot, or simply pressing the M key to zoom out to your neighbourhood, travel this time's pretty much immediate, especially when it comes to the neighbourhood view, because it's now integrated into the gameplay, compared to before, where you can only observe your neighbourhood when taking yourself away from your sim. It means all actions can be taken straight away. We can look around just like before, but at the same time, if we see a certain store or park that we'd like to visit, we can press on that location's icon and command our sim to go visit that place. What happens from there is the open world working its magic. Upon telling our sim to go somewhere, they'll either get into their vehicle and drive to the location, they might go out to the street and get a taxi, or if the location you're going to is close enough, your sim will merely end up walking or running to it. No messing about in menus, no waiting for a taxi to arrive. Travel's not only easy to initiate, it's pretty much instant, and by achieving that, you encourage the player even more to go look around the surrounding area simply because of how easy it is. Yeah, you could argue a car phasing into into existence might break immersion to a degree, with the way you access your vehicles this time literally being a snap of the fingers before being teleported into it. But with the amount of unrealistic things we've seen in literally every game up to this point, I'm taking a slight break in immersion for smooth and convenient travel any day. The travel itself is the absolute key to all this, however, and that's a factor that I think ups the immersion of Sims 3 to levels that haven't yet been seen up to this point. Going into this game, I initially questioned how vital the impact of an open world may be for a Sims game. With this not being a series where you've truly got full control, with most of our actions being revolved around preset options that we choose, I wondered how much of an impact it would actually create. As we know, this ain't no GTA. A large part of the reason the open world in Rockstar games is great is because they feel truly dynamic. You might want to go for a hike up a nearby mountain and end up getting attacked by a mountain lion that's wandering about. Sims isn't like that. You do have the odd random event, of course, but for the most part, a large number of outcomes you witness in these games will all be based around what you told them to do, and what you tell them to do is all based around what you can interact with, whereas a game like GTA is more about how you interact with things. With all that being said though, when actually experiencing the open world, it did feel revolutionary almost straight away to me. I do still understand where I was coming from initially in doubting the importance of this. The traits I admire so much about the open world don't sound too massive when taken out of context, but when put in context with the previous games in the series, it really is huge. The first major improvement would obviously be no loading screens. You're now in control the entire time until you either go to the main menu or head out your neighborhood to a different location. That idea in itself is great. I don't imagine there's many players who actively enjoy loading screens. The more time you let someone play without interrupting the experience, the better. The second great thing about having an open world is all the things we can observe along the way, which once again ties into the control we now have. Now that we're not just getting teleported to the grocery store, but instead are witnessing our car journey to it, you'll obviously find yourself passing by all the other lots in the neighborhood. This means that along the way, somewhere else you want to visit might catch your eye. A far more effective way of enticing the player to explore, compared to before where everything was locked down to a menu. With us being in control as well, this also means you can choose to ultimately defer from your initial route and go somewhere else instead. It works either way. You may still want to go to the grocery store and visit this new place afterwards, or you might scrap the idea of going to get groceries entirely and actively divert your route to the other place. Something else I love about the open world is just the immersion of it, as I've ultimately hinted at a few times already. Because of the type of game Sims is, one where you do find yourself gaining pleasure from the smallest details possible, travelling throughout a neighbourhood is yet another one of those factors. Because as I said, travel's not locked down to solely vehicles. If you want to make your way to a nearby park on foot, you can very much do that. And a simple walk to the park, something that I have to remind again was just not possible in the previous games, has tons of small things that could ultimately enrich your experience. The calming ambience of distant traffic and birds chirping nearby, the way we can more effectively look around and take in the scenery, compared to when moving in vehicles that are pretty fast no matter which one you're in. And I can't help but feel staying with our sim during all these moments had a substantial effect on how much deeper I connected with them. Because there's now so few times our attention's taken away from them, we do very much feel like we're observing every single part of their life. Linking back to that take a spin option with vehicles in Sims 2, there's several times in the first two games that are just like that. Times where your sim goes off to do their own thing before coming back later. Understand that even when it comes to work in this game, you now obviously witness the entire journey to your workplace, with the only time they disappear being when they go inside whatever building their work's at. But that second part doesn't really matter, considering we can now see where they work, which ultimately does enough for me. In the first two games, it was still a case of your sim going off and then coming back. Outside their job role, we had no real idea what they do, where they work, and what their place of work looks like. Details that I do think are important, especially given how much time your sim can spend working in these games. And we can't forget, looking from the angle of interactivity, the open world's excellent once again. I mentioned the idea of seeing new buildings that we might want to look at during our travels, but don't underestimate, these neighborhoods now feel more alive in just about every way. Think about it like this. We went from Sims 1, where the extent of the activity we saw on the neighborhood screen was a Loch Ness monster that would show up. You then had Sims 2, which improved things a bit, now seeing things like cars driving about. But once again, that only applied to the neighborhood screen. You could see that kind of stuff happening from that point of view, but all of a sudden, when controlling your sim, there's nothing to be seen. Even when you're in areas like downtown, you're seeing these tall skyscrapers and tight city streets, yet don't see many Sims wandering about outside, and don't see any kind of vehicles driving driving by at all. The lots ultimately do a ton of heavy lifting when you boil it down. By drawing your attention to things inside these lots, it keeps your mind away from thinking how barren the surroundings actually are. If you're in a city environment, you kind of expect way more cars and Sims to be present, but they're just not. Now, that side of things doesn't change massively in Sims 3. City environments we see in this game, for example, can still feel quite barren. I have to assume it's mainly a technical drawback compared to anything else. You'll notice in most of these games actually, but most prominently in Sims 2 and 3, that when there's quite a bit going on around you, these games really start to struggle. We're talking about FPS drops, and pretty severe ones at that when fast forwarding. When you're in your house doing your own thing, it runs absolutely fine. But as you can see, when you've got loads of Sims around you, all performing their own individual actions, games like Sims 2 can damn near fall apart if you're speeding everything up. Sims 3 definitely has those FPS issues when travelling around neighbourhoods, and no, it's not an issue on my end. Not only have I witnessed these same kind of drops many times when looking at other footage, but I'm also fully running this game on a top-line M.2 SSD, basically the fastest kind of storage out there. Not a big issue, but definitely something I noticed. As I say, but I assume this comes from all the different processes and actions that take place, with all the Sims that are now being presented to us all at once. That ties back to what my initial point was though, and that's what we're actually witnessing this time. We're now at a point where we get to experience something as close to real life as we've gotten so far. We can simulate a whole day out without breaking at any point in time. We could start the day off with a calming walk, get a coffee along the way, go to an art museum and talk to some other Sims there, and then maybe go to a restaurant before heading back home. All of this is entirely fluid. We're going from one place to the next while staying fully in control, and the ultimate effect of this is just brilliant. I'd say it's the game that by quite some margin had me connecting with my Sim, and actively wanting to see every single thing that plays out around them. There's so many points in the other games where your Sim goes off and does their own thing that you kind of get used to it, thus creating more of a disconnect. Now we are genuinely reaching almost the apex of the whole godlike role we've played all this time. We're watching down over quite literally everything they do, with only a few exceptions. It should be said though, despite the grand improvement the open world brings, there's definitely some aspects in the neighbourhoods that have taken a step back, which I once again assume tie into some kind of tech restriction. Key ones would be things like how much we get to see of certain buildings, and how our Sims interact with them. Despite there being many places we can actually enter and walk around in, there's a weird number of these now that have regressed in terms of how we interact with them. Take the grocery stores we talked about for example. You'll see in this clip that when going inside, our Sim fades away, much like they do when going to work for example, before then having a list of items show up on screen for us to purchase. However, you buy your things and then your Sim walks back out. We don't get to actually experience our Sim walking around the shop, and we're not allowed to make him pick up and buy certain items, which is odd considering that's something we can do in both previous games. And again, I'm kind of scratching my head as to why. As we've seen, there's plenty of other buildings here that have fully fleshed out interiors, so I don't imagine a small grocery shop was going to be the breaking point towards the game falling apart. The only thing I could see being a possible cause of this is the food items themselves. Despite having multiple stalls we can look at in previous grocery stores, they all offered the exact same thing. Now that you've got tons of individual items, maybe that makes it a bit more difficult to implement. I'll be honest though, but I don't know really. I feel like if they really wanted to, they could have found a way to implement the interior like before, but alas, it's not to be. If it was just the grocery store though, I'm not sure I would have cared all that much or really made a point of bringing it up. My problem comes about when looking at some of the other buildings here that have had the exact same thing happen to them, and that's where you do start thinking it might be a resource issue. As before obviously, all these locations were confined to individual lots we had to load into, whereas now they're part of one genuine open world. Restaurants for example were essentially all rabbit holes in this game, whereas before every restaurant we went to was fully modelled. Now you've got ones where your Sim goes inside to get food, while we're stuck on the outside. Even weirder for me is how certain stores are entirely absent. One of the most common stores I went to in previous games were clothing stores, being able to go in and try out different kinds of outfits. These are literally gone in Sims 3. The only occasion where you can go into a shop and buy clothing like before is in the future location Oasis Landing. Now if you want new clothes, you simply have to go to your wardrobe and use the plan outfit option, in which you're brought back to the create a Sim screen where every single item's made available to you. Odd, as I say, with me still not really knowing why they chose to streamline the game in this way. You're essentially removing depth for no apparent reason. How far are we gonna go? Streamline the buy mode to where everything costs the exact same? The point of buying clothing is that it was not only an immersive feature that felt fun to engage with, it was also something else we had to spend money on. By taking that away, you not only remove those fun periods where we watch our sim trying out new clothes, but you also take away from the management side too. Putting that aside though, the open world is an utterly fantastic idea, and one that's executed to about the level you'd expect. The only place you could realistically go from here is to have a Sims game that's so open world to where you actually travel between different neighborhoods on your own, as opposed to being teleported there. As we'll see though, Sims 4 hilariously seems to look completely away from an outcome like that, and instead end up somewhere in between Sims 2 and 3, disappointing a lot of fans as a result. Now, turning our gaze back to what we actually do in this game, I'll try skirt round things that at this point you're very familiar with. You gotta look after your Sim's needs like always, with the act of doing that being easier than ever, to be honest. We're now at a point where all these get satisfied at a much faster rate. There were so many times in Sims 1 where I had to make 2 meals because I let my Sim's hunger run down. That's just not really the case anymore. Much like back then, there were a few times where I let my hunger run down significantly, and upon eating even the lowest quality food you can imagine, you can see it rise right back up. So if we're being honest, the structure's basically identical, just a bit easier to manage. And in many ways, the reason that's been done is because the external elements have been brought to a whole nother level. There seems to be an active awareness at this point that despite still refining all the core elements of the series, they're constantly trying to bring in new stuff to ensure the experience stays fresh. A key example of that for me would be the idea of festivals that can show up during certain seasons, as well as community events that'll occur each week. This is a concept that we see get expanded even more in Sims 4, but for now, what these do is bring constant events, as I say, both weekly and seasonal, to essentially keep things fresh, to always have something going on. With the festivals, these can oftentimes appear similar to your average fun fair, featuring things like booths where you can get your face painted, eating competitions, roller skating rinks, and these all vary depending on what season you're in. For spring, you can take part in Easter egg hunts, for example. In winter, you can have snowball fights and ice skate. Really good stuff. With the additional switch-ups when it comes to what season you're in being a really nice touch. The community events are a lot more standard though, and are more like mini challenges that will result in your sim getting a reward of some kind, mostly extra money. We get ones like Chess Tournament, where we have to win 3 games of chess within 6 hours. There's also ones like Music Appreciation Day, where we have to play guitar 5 times throughout the day. As I say, they're not events really, and more just challenges, ways to either spice up the gameplay or get some extra funds. But I'm still glad they're here, obviously. When you've got a formula that's now so established, you're now doing a balancing act, with all aspects essentially having to raise their game, despite perhaps some areas not being cared about as much from returning fans. Like I say, when it comes to things like cooking, this has once again taken a step up. We get even more food options compared to last time, we've got the recipe system now at play which diversifies those options, and the actual cooking skill can create even more of an impact given the effects that well-made food can now apply onto our character via the moodlet system. The recipes in particular I think are a great addition when you look deeper into them. The variations of certain meals we can make is great. We're looking outside certain ingredient combinations that make brand new meals. We can also make alternate versions of certain dishes to remove other ingredients, usually as a way to make them vegetarian, with that now being a trait. So if you plan to make chili con carne, but remember your sim's got the vegetarian trait, instead of buying steak, you can buy tofu to make a vegetarian chili instead. A brilliant addition, expanding the amount of food options, while realistically not requiring that much work to get them in. They're not having to create new models, for example. No matter what chili you make, it still looks the exact same. But that's ultimately what I'm getting at when talking about expanding elements that some may find to be done by this point. It not only keeps those elements fresh for players who may still be interested, but for the many newcomers, they're immediately experiencing a system that's superior to what came before. And I highlight that simply to reinstate my appreciation. Given the more expansive direction this game ultimately goes in, it's good to see that certain key staples aren't merely being repeated verbatim. This can be applied to much of the build and buy features too. Same general idea, just more expansion and refinement. You'll see with how the menus are laid out this time, they've gone heavily in the direction of that filter by room option we saw in Sims 1 and 2, and I've got no problem with that. We've still got icons to relay everything, and we can even still filter all these items merely by their category, as opposed to where you might find them in your house. But weirdly, I actually find that approach to be more convoluted now, mainly because of the icons we now see in these menus. It's not make or break or anything, and maybe other people don't feel this way, but given how these now appear, showing these very minimalist icons that are all inside the exact same shaped boxes. It felt like these options were blending together a bit more than usual, and especially when you compare these icons to the more fleshed out ones we see in the room layouts. As I say, I found it much easier to navigate the other option. There's no real point discussing much of the furniture here, as you can already guess that for the base game and all the DLCs, we end up with the largest amount of options so far, most of which retain that same quality we expect by this point. Where things start getting a lot more interesting is when it comes to certain minor tweaks that can actually end up creating major impacts, as well as the re-emergence of features we talked about in the creator sim that work superbly well in this new context. The first thing that comes to mind as being a very nice improvement is the easing of the adherence to the grid. Don't get me wrong, the grid is still here, and I'm glad it is. But what you'll find this time is that when placing down objects, you'll oftentimes be able to work in between the lines, as opposed to before where you were locked down to each separate square. This single change finally fixes those problems I talked about, where you've got a TV that's only in front of one specific seat on a couch, or a dining table that just can't quite fit in the center of a room given the dimensions of it. Things like that can still happen. We're still not working with a completely free placement system, but it's a great improvement. Regarding that other feature I referred to, this is known as create a style, and is basically the exact same thing we saw when creating styles for our clothing being applied to items in our house. So if you've got a table you like the look of, but want it to have a fabric texture compared to one that's wooden, you can now apply that and make further tweaks to make it the exact style you desire. Sounds simplistic, but it's still damn impressive given the number of styles there are, how they can be customized, and the sheer number of objects these styles can be applied to. The amount of creativity someone can flex with these tools now is truly amazing, and that's all we were ever looking for from the very first game. A way for players to create exactly what they want. The perfect kind of sandbox experience. And for the type of game Sims is, I'd say Sims 3 comes damn close to being perfect in this department. Yeah, you can always have more items and more tools to mess around with, but in a way, I kind of like having limits to a degree. It might just be me, but you've heard several times by this point how the amount of choice can sometimes be overwhelming to a player like me. I love it, don't get me wrong, so long as the options are quality, but for me as an individual, I'm someone who gets disinterested pretty quickly when being hit with walls of text and complicated functions. What Sims does excellently in my view, and pretty much always has, is make these tools easy to understand and use, so that's a big positive. What I've almost always picked out as being not so great though, is the navigation of these ever-expanding menus. That doesn't mean I want less items or anything, but it does tell me that even if we did have the perfect UI system, there'll always come a point where I feel there's too much. Now look, I might be alone in that thinking, but as someone who wants to experience everything these games have to offer, while not spending literal hours choosing a hairstyle and carefully constructing how it appears, time is definitely a factor in all this for me. The more items you add, the more I feel the need to sift through all the options, and if those options don't feel substantially different to each other, which in a few occasions can definitely be the case, it turns me off from looking deeper in other areas. But even when saying that, I've got this paradox in my mind where even if these were all quality, all offering different things, would I still be satisfied? I really don't know. Maybe it is the UI, and maybe it is just my individual mindset, but I can't help but feel that for all the praise I've given towards variation and freedom, Sims is one of the very few games where I sometimes feel there's too much. I can't deny, maybe that is the point. You give players so many options to the point where you almost know they won't look at all of them. You leave a door open in future playthroughs where they'll be surprised when discovering a certain item for the first time. I kind of feel that same way about games like Minecraft too. Despite liking the idea of now having all these different kind of stones, like andesite or diorite, and understanding how players will enjoy using these in their builds, there'll always be a part of me that prefers the original route of just having stone, gravel, and dirt showing up while mining. And in a way, we can make ties right back to my questioning mindset on Sims. When I'm seeing all these different stone blocks filling up my inventory, they start becoming a nuisance. I prefer to focus on collecting other resources compared to keeping those. Applying that to Sims, I've got my own personal tastes. I know what I like in a creative sense. Therefore, everything here that doesn't suit my tastes could be symbolized as stone blocks cluttering up my inventory. And in saying that, I feel like I've stumbled upon a solution, and one that, funny enough, Sims 4 actually nails. We need some kind of favoriting system so we can highlight items that are exactly to our tastes, as we do in real life when adding things to our cart or putting them on a wish list. Sims 4 not only does that brilliantly, but as we'll see, it also allows us to actually find all these items we might want to favourite much easier as well. So, room for improvement in the UI department still, despite enjoying the further improvements we see in the room layout side of things. The indoor building and buying is about what you'd expect once again, with some nice quality of life improvements when it comes to things like stairs and basements now. For stairs, you now have things like automatic railings that get applied to them, as well as having a nice slider that now allows you to increase the width of each stairway. And in terms of basements, these haven't even been a thing in previous games really. In Sims 2, there were ways to create a basement type environment, but the way in which you did this was far more convoluted and finicky than you might think. I don't think basements were even supposed to be a feature back then, because as you're able to see in certain shops for example, there's stairways down that just lead to nothing. Sims 3 now has an actual basement option, as you're able to see on the build menu itself, allowing us to create a basement considerably easier compared to last time. Alongside that, you've got things like terrain paints that I think are excellent, letting you spray certain kinds of outer grounds like grass, rocky pathways and concrete in a way that allows you to blend these things far more naturally compared to the usual flooring we see. Speaking of the ground, on top of featuring the terrain options we saw before, allowing us to raise, lower and flatten the ground, we also now have things like the pond option, basically utilising the same tools while immediately filling whatever space you carve out with water. The final big addition I perceive with these is the brand new blueprints option, essentially being another layer to the preset houses we've always known, by now letting us place individual preset rooms into our house. Naturally, this means that compared to actually searching for things like counters, fridges and stoves, we can just go to the blueprints tab, find a kitchen we like and place it straight into our home. You'll have some people saying these take away from the creativity, but in my view they're just as, and in fact might be even outright better compared to the normal preset houses, and I don't see any issue with them at all. Understand that while you might think it's ultimately a more satisfying experience creating a house that's exactly your vision, even down to the smallest decorations, not everyone's gonna think like that. Don't get me wrong, I am more in line with that kind of thinking. I think it's natural the more time and effort you put into something, so long as you're enjoying your time doing it, will yield overall more satisfaction with what you create. But not everyone has time for that, of course, whether it be genuine time constraints in your real life, or simply the want to spend more time playing live mode compared to building. That's always been a factor of my thinking with the preset options we've seen going back to Sims 1. For those who aren't into customization as much and don't want to waste their time on it, you always had those preset houses with preset families that you could take control of straight away. What I love about the blueprints is it lands somewhere right in the middle, letting players give their house a creative and unique touch while still relying on things that are being created for you, not from you. So for example, you might have a general foundation in your mind that you want to carry out, so you can build up your outer walls, different floors, and the general size of your house in quite a short amount of time. And then when it comes to actually mapping out rooms, buying all the furniture, you can now fall back on the blueprints to save yourself time. Now, there's not tons of these, but there are definitely enough to satisfy players who want to engage with this system. If we look at blueprints for a study, for example, there's only 3 to choose from, but that's not a huge issue in my eyes, to be honest, as they're still customizable. So if you like the general look of a living room, for example, but don't like a few details, you can put it in and simply take those details out. And regardless, even if you're working with blueprints without any further customization, there's still definitely enough here to ensure your house remains unique. With how you can mix and match all these, you might have a certain kitchen template you always gravitate to whenever you build a house, but you might switch up areas like the bathroom or dining room, resulting in a house that, despite having similar parts, feels different because of the areas you switch up, as well as the alternate foundation you've more than likely built too. So I think blueprints are a great idea. As I say, a brilliant middle ground between curating options for the player while not having literally everything be done for them. In regards to much of the other elements of the experience, you'll start noticing how much of what I alluded to at points in previous games is now fully present. The commentary I enjoyed so much in the first game is almost completely absent. The monetization options reach a new level by not only having even more expansion packs, but now also having a full-on store where we can buy individual item packs and neighborhoods via in-game currency. That currency is referred to as sim points, and it's literally what you'd expect, ranging from 1,000 sim points for about $10 to over 24,000 for $160. These can't be earned through playing, so you can't even compare them to something like V-Bucks really. They're more like FIFA points, for example. And in classic EA fashion, this was another wise business move to maximize profits. You're basically getting even less bang for your buck at this point, and amazingly, people somehow still bought into it. Whereas the expansion packs still feature all the different neighborhoods, new activities, and new items that you'd expect. By adding in all these different bits that now aren't directly attached to a DLC, you're giving players more choice, yes, but that choice now depends on buying a certain amount of currency, and you can see very blatantly from some of the pricing how they go about getting as much money as possible. In-game currency in itself is usually quite a slimy idea, with me seeing very few examples where it's been dealt with in a fair manner. Sims 3 is a clear example of that practice, and while people like to complain about it, it's on you not to feed into it. The sheer amount of people I see that complain about these things while still buying these currencies, it's insane. If you don't like or support what these companies are doing, thing, don't feed into their business scheme. You're just proving their model works perfectly. EA particularly has been criticised for years over how they approach monetization, but guess what? They haven't changed their approach at all. In fact, it's only gotten worse. Reason being, especially in their case, they're still earning absurd amounts of money despite that criticism. It's the most powerful position to be in realistically, to be known by this point as being a pretty scummy company that tries to get as much money as possible from their audience, and still getting that money regardless. The Sims 3 store did seem particularly egregious to me though, when looking at the prices. Today, while sim points still have to be used to buy certain sets, we can now go to the EA app and buy certain things that were previously locked to the store with real money. But firstly, with the sim points, you can see the initial model. Looking at a world like Sunlit Tides for example, you had one version that cost 2,450 points, and a gold version that cost 3,524. These gold versions simply adding more items you can purchase separately. Notice the pricing though, that's the most important part. As we saw, there's only a set amount of sim points we can buy. We can't choose exactly how many we want, and that's where they get you obviously. You might only want the standard Sunlit Tides pack, but as there's no in between for the 2040 and 5000 options, you've got to make a choice. Do you buy the 2040 one and then one for 1000? Do you spend more money to get 5000 because it's better value? And because the prices are oftentimes so particular, intentionally so I'll add, you're almost always going to have some points left over, and psychologically, if you've got some leftover points on your account, the next time you see something you might want to buy, you could be fooled to think you're being smart when buying more at a lower price, when really you're just getting played. It doesn't matter if you buy a lower amount of sim points to make up for what you already have, you're still buying more. So yeah, but I'm not a big fan of the business model in general with these games. Any game that starts offering upwards of 5 DLCs, I always start to raise my eyebrows about what's included. Highly praised DLCs like Blood and Wine for Witcher 3 for example, you can completely understand why it's being offered in that way. It's a brand new, expansive experience, and one that works outside the base game. Despite what avid fans may say, you're still getting a complete experience even when playing solely the base game. Sims, however, oftentimes doesn't really feel like that. I think the best thing we could have seen with these games is DLC that relates mainly to the fantastical stuff. You kind of understand in the first two games if we got more expansions relating to real world stuff. In Sims 1, you get that gradual escalation of going to areas outside your house, and that's a great expansion to see. On top of that, you also got tons of new items to place in your house, as well as new clothing items, and I like how that's also a feature with all the expansions. Sims 2's pretty much in the same vein, but with a couple exceptions. While you get some really good ones in the real world department, like apartment life and university, you've also got other ones like Bon Voyage and nightlife, concepts that when you think about what we saw in the first game, you might have expected to be in the base game. We already saw both those concepts in the first game with DLCs like Vacation and Hot Date. Expansions, in my opinion, should only offer things that are perhaps only thought about during the creation of the base game, and then get elaborated on after the fact. In some cases though, no matter the game, you see that's just not the case. The concept of vacations was already thought about in Sims 1, and was brought in via DLC. To then not have that in the base game of 2, and then selling that concept yet again as DLC, it seems odd to me. They can do what they want of course, release whatever they want in their expansion packs, but sequels, in theory, should pretty much always be a case of expanding and refining what came before. There's things we saw in the other DLCs in the first game that do end up in the base game, so why is that not the case all round? Again, I think a large part ultimately comes down to money. As a business, if you find yourself in a situation where you've got a certain part of the game that can realistically be segmented, why wouldn't you do that? Especially in the case of EA, you might be called out as being greedy somewhat, but once again, as a business, if you're getting those profits, does it really matter what these players think? I'm not claiming to be the most business savvy guy in the world. At the end of the day, no one's truly got any idea what's going on at companies like EA, except the people who work there. But from the outside looking in, it seems pretty blatant to me that not all DLC realistically had to be DLC to begin with. There's plenty of cases, especially in recent games, where DLCs purposely thought about during the creation of a game, having certain content be created and purposely held back to be sold to you later on, giving the impression to your audience these things are brand new, when realistically they've just been sat on the back burner till the time's right. I definitely think it's important we touch on this though, as it's something that during my research of these games kept coming up from the fanbase, most prominently in relation to Sims 4, a game that's been highly criticised not only for the sheer amount of DLC they offer, but how much of it actually ties into concepts that we already saw in the past two games. Not just their DLCs, but their base games too. We'll touch on that more later though. As we're on the topic, I think it's only right to actually observe some of the DLCs we get. We've gone over most of the big evolutions in the base game. Obviously things like the open world, the building improvements, but outside those things, you are still playing a Sims game. Some grand reinvention isn't exactly what fans would be looking for with these games. We've got to realise that given the series and the audience it attracts, one that I perceive to be very casual, almost non-gamers in parts, you are looking at things like graphics, performance, and expansion on things we've already seen, compared to any kind of huge evolution to the gameplay systems. Like we already saw, some of the most vital ones we get in this game tie into things like traits, wishes, and so on. Things that definitely enhance the experience, but not to a degree where they're absolute game changers in my view. When playing Sims 2, for example, I'm not desperately wishing the trait system was in that game, despite still realising it's a great feature when playing Sims 3. One thing I will highlight as a final big improvement for the base game though, is definitely how the surrounding families work compared to previous games. While the families in Sims 2 still featured the idea of aging, much of how they functioned outside that was still pretty static. Sims 2 mainly evolved families when it came to the family tree, whereas in the first game you couldn't really identify anything about these families except who's in a relationship and who's got a kid. Sims 2, especially in relation to the preset families, expands that idea way more with the family tree. You can now see pretty much every single relation each family member's got with each other. You can see uncles, aunties, grandparents, nephews, all that kind of stuff. And on top of that, details get highlighted like if certain couples got divorced, if someone becomes a widow, and obviously which kids came from which parents. Along with the aging, that's about the extent though. What Sims 3 does to switch things up is take those kinds of family dynamics that are applied to your own families and apply them to all the families in whatever neighbourhood you're in, creating a far more dynamic and lively community overall. So compared to before, where you would simply witness a family age, now you can witness the family expand if someone has a kid, or you might witness some drama if someone gets a divorce. A great addition that adds to the idea of neighbourhood drama that I see many players get totally sucked into. You're not only going to get attached to these families now based on their backstories, you can now check on them over time and see what they're up to. Before it was literally a case of giving you that backstory and then having you carry out their lives from that point on. It's an evolution of storytelling. You no longer have to be the one to advance it. You can now much more naturally watch each family's lives and all the events that take place in them play out entirely on their own. As for those DLCs though, I think it's important we take a look at these in particular, especially some of the more outlandish ones, to ultimately see the different kind of direction they take compared to the core experience. Exploring some of the different neighbourhoods we get with these, we end up witnessing a trait I admire straight away. You've obviously got the different appearances of the neighbourhoods themselves, which is great, and you've also got all the different families with their individual backstories to witness. But in combining those two elements, I think you end up getting many here that establish unique identities for themselves almost immediately, thus drawing the player into each neighbourhood to begin with, and then subsequently making them want to return when exploring even deeper. A highlight for me would be a place like Midnight Hollow, somewhere that can only be accessed by buying it in the store. Looking around this place, I love the dark, gothic look to everything, making it feel unique pretty much straight away. Given the setting, there were parts of the map I really wanted to explore. Areas like the glowing red forests, or the nearby graveyards. It's got a mysterious quality to it that pulled me in, and as I say, upon exploring deeper, I started seeing things that no other neighbourhood had shown to me up till then. We're talking about the unique architecture, the dark environments regardless of what time it is, and in terms of the residents, we can even see actual ghosts wandering about, who we can also interact with. It's the same kind of principle when it comes to maps in any kind of game, to be honest, but given the kind of game Sims is, and what it focuses on, you'd argue these things are especially important in this case. In a game like Call of Duty, for example, the primary focus that players have with each new map is how it flows, how it plays. There's many maps I've played that, despite not appearing impressive, feel great to play. Sims is quite a bit different though, given how the gameplay's always been very pared back, always being a case of merely pointing and clicking to perform an action. The important features primarily come back to appearance and layout. How's the neighbourhood set up? What buildings do we have to explore? And how are things appearing differently to other neighbourhoods we've already seen? It's primarily about immersion realistically, creating these varying environments with different atmospheres that'll appeal to individual players' tastes. From that point, it's simply about nailing those atmospheres and adding all those fine details we talked about to create a neighbourhood that feels lived in, intriguing, and spurs players on to explore and live in each one. When it comes to the functionalities and activities the DLCs introduce, as I say, some are brand new, others we've seen before in essentially the exact same form. You've got ones like Seasons, which not only works almost the exact same as what we got in Sims 2, but also obviously has the exact same name as well. The main expansion in this one ties back to the seasonal events realistically. Outside that, it's all merely refinement in regards to the same concept. You get more like this, which once again I found confusing confusing, given the fact these were already DLCs in the previous game. Ones like university life, which returns to the idea of universities that we saw in Sims 2, while bringing in certain new aspects like social groups, allowing you to align yourself with 3 groups, those being jock, nerd, and rebel, where doing certain activities will now up your level in relation to one of these, which in turn gives you brand new abilities to use. Again though, the inherent concept's the exact same as last time, as you might expect from a DLC like this. Where things become a lot more interesting for me is in ones like World Adventures, Ambitions, Into the Future, and Supernatural. The last of those we already talked about obviously. World Adventures in particular piqued my interest due to the wildly different approach it takes in a gameplay sense. Pretty much everything we'd seen up to this point was all based around a few key things. What new areas we can explore, what new interactions our Sims can experience, and what new items we can buy. World Adventures goes in a totally different direction to all that. You still have new areas and new items obviously, but upon entering these new locations, weirdly being the first time we're given real world areas in the form of China, France, and Egypt, you'll notice that we're given this immediate focus on these brand new objectives. You can see there's an option that says report in, and upon pressing this, our Sim will head to what's basically a quest giver, and after we talk with them, it's a matter of carrying out a number of tasks till the objective's complete. The big thing here is what we do in many of these, as we end up seeing a level of interactivity that's been almost entirely absent up to now. A key example for me would be the pyramids we can enter in Egypt, something I'm glad to see can be investigated at any time. You'll see almost immediately we're now engaging in a kind of gameplay that's almost alien to the series. We're used to these games giving us a number of options, where upon selecting one, everything's played out in front of our eyes. In this case, we're working with a more conventional route, one that gives the player more control and puts more importance on our input. The gameplay's based around solving puzzles basically, but trust me, these puzzles really aren't all that challenging. The trickiest these periods get is when it comes to pushing and pulling certain objects, as you might not initially understand what to do, and end up moving objects incorrectly, thus meaning you've got to correct yourself. But a significant amount of our progression still comes back to simply finding something to interact with, and then letting our Sim do all the work. It still feels like quite a big switch up though, and one that I actually found myself enjoying quite a bit. I didn't necessarily care that much about what I was getting out of these, despite being able to collect unique things like certain currencies and artifacts. The mere act of doing these activities felt enjoyable in itself. It was a nice change of pace from what we usually see in these games. It's not uncommon when doing some kind of activity for our Sim to disappear into a building and then come out when they're finished. That very well could have been the same case here, so I'm glad to see there's now a bit more depth and interactivity. Not to mention as well, given how this DLC definitely resembles the previous Vacation expansions, the open world setting undeniably works wonders this time. I just naturally felt the want to explore, even if there wasn't any kind of objective or activity I was directly making my way towards. So the World Adventures DLC, definitely a big fan. The Into the Future DLC gave me a similar vibe with the Oasis landing area, with me really enjoying the feeling of getting engrossed in this new futuristic environment, using things like jetpacks and hoverboards to make my way around, while entering buildings that allow you to design nanites and interact with plumbots. Not to mention as well, there's a brilliant mechanic with this place where the appearance of Oasis Landing will alter depending on what you do when going back to the present, being given 3 distinct appearances, those being dystopian, normal, and utopian futures, which all vary quite a bit in their appearances, and all of which require us to perform a certain number of actions to activate them. Stepping far away from the grounded nature of the core experience once again, but that's happened so many times by now, it's hardly worth commenting on. The world of Sims is now one where fairies and werewolves are just a thing. Picking up on fantastical elements at this point is fairly irrelevant. The final DLC I want to touch on for right now is Ambitions, an expansion that lies somewhere in the middle of the more interactive elements we saw in previous ones I talked about, while staying in the realm of our normal daily life. The 2 biggest things I take away from this DLC tie right back to our work, now being able to access what are called active professions, and also finally having an official self-employment option. You could realistically be self-employed in previous games, maybe decide to earn money solely by selling paintings or performing to an audience, but now it can be defined as an actual career path, letting you level up just as you would when getting promotions in regular jobs, which as you could assume also means you're leveling up your skill at the same time, which means over time you'll be earning more money from whatever it is you're doing. Another great feature, but although you'd probably argue this one airs more on the side of mere clarification and refinement as opposed to any great reinvention of earning money outside of standard work. What is a pretty big reinvention though are the jobs we can now take part in, and to put it simply, these are basically the kind of jobs many fans have been wanting since the very first game. While we've already seen normal work still present in this game, that being periods where your Sim disappears into a building for a number of hours before coming back home. With these professions, we now have a number of jobs that we can fully partake in throughout the day, keeping the experience even more engaging, even more immersive, and due to the implementation of these, even more fun. I love the fact these weren't reduced to some kind of mini-game, as I really could envision that kind of outcome in a different scenario. We'll use the firefighter job as an example. Each day you gotta go to work. It starts off pretty much the exact same as always. You wake up, get ready, and then once your carpool arrives, you get taken to your place of work. Immediately you'll notice that compared to simply disappearing inside a building, something that Sims fans refer to as rabbit holes, the whole interior of the fire department loads in. That in itself is a huge step forward that shouldn't merely be ignored. Getting to actually see where we work is something that quite literally never happened in games prior to Sims 3. And while normal jobs still only show the exterior, it's great that we've also got interiors to observe now in certain roles. As you can see, like pretty much all the interiors that are pre-made, the design of the fire department's really nice. Exactly what you'd expect. But outside how this place looks, the first thing I noticed and quickly appreciated was in regards to what we actually do. In the career tab, you'll see we've got responsibilities like responding to emergencies, befriending co-workers, immediately giving this job a completely different feel to normal work. Our work days are no longer a case of waiting till our sim's done, and that in itself I feel should be highlighted. As I mentioned a second ago, there's a number of ways they could have carried this out in my view that just would have been really annoying. For example, having the interior be shown, but still having your sim get on with everything on their own. Or maybe go in the complete other direction and have your entire day completely filled with activities. As I say, reducing it more to some kind of mini-game that would have got almost immediately tiresome. Instead, they take a near perfect approach of trying to replicate what an actual workday might be like. This means that while you will end up having the fire alarm go off at points, it's not constant, and that's where the other responsibilities come in. These being ways to increase your job experience while not overtly performing your set role. And that's ultimately the part I love the most. Yeah, it's also great to actually perform our jobs this time, hopping into a fire engine to go extinguish fires in buildings, with that feeling of control making our job feel so much more satisfying. Getting an actual insight into what our sim does each day, and almost making the money we get feel more earned. But it's those in-between moments that arguably stood out the most to me. Wandering about and taking in the fire station, maintaining our truck, working out for a while, and not to mention just doing normal things like making ourselves some food or talking with our workmates. It all might sound rather basic, but realistically, you could apply that to much of Sims anyway. What may come across as rather basic and bland gets a whole different reaction in this case solely because of the context we see it in. So in highlighting some of the main DLCs we get in this game, I hope I've conveyed how great some of them really are. Many of these are described by fans as pretty much essential, and in a way, I do kind of agree with that. Ultimately, that ties back to the business model at play. In different hands, you almost definitely would see much of what I've talked about in the base game, or at the very least, implemented via free updates. But it is what it is. Wrapping up our time with Sims 3, I believe what we see with this game is yet another massive step forward for the series, but also one that I think has less to actually talk about. I think from Sims 1 to 2, you saw numerous additions that simply weren't there previously, as well as further refinement to the core foundations too. Sims 3 has a few brand new and big selling points in its base game and DLCs, obviously being things like the open world, the more dynamic neighborhoods, making jobs more interactive. These are all fantastic, and are key things that set this game apart from what came before. In a way though, while I personally observe Sims 2 as a full-on evolution, which I think shown off in both a visual and functional sense, Sims 3 errs more on the side of an outright refinement of what we saw in Sims 2, as opposed to another evolution. What I mean is, there's a lot of groundwork set up in 2 that only feels like it's capitalised on in Sims 3. We start witnessing a more sprawling world in 2, one that we can travel around much easier, but are still restricted to these bite-sized lots. 3 looks at that and takes the next step. As I say, I perceive that as arguably the most important evolution in this game. But outside that, I'll say again, there's a lot here that's either more of the same or basically unchanged. Social options get more expansive, for example, but the actual depth of the conversations feels the same. In my opinion, it doesn't really matter that we get unique dialogue relating to certain traits or abilities our sim has. While being a nice touch, the impact just isn't really there. I never witnessed any of these new dialogue options result in something I hadn't already seen. You talk with someone nicely, your relationship meter goes up. You insult them, your relationship meter goes down. It really is still that simple. And that's kind of what I mean in regards to much of what we see here. For what changes are made to things like the social side, or our skills, or our needs, I think we're now at a stage where there's no going back. I think Sims 2 could be the last game in the series that truly switches things up in a pretty massive way. As I say, we're talking about things like a jump from 2D to 3D, life stages, wants and fears. And while Sims 3 did a pretty good job to almost become the definitive Sims experience upon its release, taking almost everything from the past games and trying to make them all reach their natural apex, that's all it is to me, and all I think it really needed to be. I don't even see the point of trying to drastically shake things up at this stage. They know what works, and they know what people want, and I feel they totally proved that with this game. What's pretty bizarre to me though, is that when turning our attention to the final Sims game, as of right now, they end up taking a full-on backstep in a huge amount of areas, leaving fans of the series disappointed during its initial release, with some being permanently burned, and leaving us with a game that, as we're about to see, is still missing certain things from previous games, despite now having countless free updates and more DLC than any of the other games by a mile.